Welcome, everyone. We're very glad to see you all here today. It's a warm and nice day here in New York City, and I hope the weather is good and that you are all well wherever you are. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm honored to serve as president of ACLS and very happy to welcome you all here today. We're gathering here for our interest and delectation. We're very excited to do so, of an impressive group of scholars and curators and administrators. This is a conversation moderated by Alexandra, who's chair of the Division of Medicine and Science at the Smithsonian Institute and also a member of our ACLS Board of Directors. This event is part of our Humanistic Scholarship in the 21st Century series. It's a series that amplifies our conversations about humanistic knowledge, its creation, its circulation, and the challenges and opportunities facing us, to coin a phrase, with partners from museums and libraries, corporations, community centers, colleges, universities, and others. We at ACLS believe strongly, and this drives our work every day, that knowledge is a public good. And this means that our commitment to a diverse academy and an academy able, nimble to connect with diverse audiences is strong. We also believe in fostering relationships and collaborations between scholars working in the traditional institutions of the academy and colleges and universities of all types, and scholars and people who are not scholars, but nonetheless scholarly and interested in the circulation and production of knowledge, working in a variety of roles outside the classroom, outside the library. We try to express these commitments in a variety of ways, and I want to share just a couple with you. In the summer of 2020, in response to the pandemic and the social needs we and many others, many of you I'm sure saw, we set up a new fellowship program for recent PhDs. It was initially funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. It's now funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We call it the Leading Edge Fellowship. It places PhDs in non-academic posts, but bringing their humanistic skills and capacities and perspectives to bear, working on COVID-related projects and a variety of social justice initiatives. And I'm especially happy to welcome one of the Leading Edge Fellows to this conversation. In all areas of our work, we encourage the integration of voices and perspectives from outside the academy into our own thinking. We really see ourselves as permeable and engaged, not closed off. We celebrate the co-creation of knowledge where scholars work in partnership with communities, and we're especially intrigued by the possibilities for greater public understanding and richer civic discourse that are created by the work of performances and displays and exhibits in the public eye. So this makes us really especially happy to host this discussion. So now I'm pleased to introduce the person who will do the bulk of the work of the next step, that is Dr. Lord, who will serve as our moderator. Lexi, as we know her familiarly, serves, as I said, as chair of the Division of Medicine and Science at the Smithsonian. Her scholarly interests are broad. They include the practice and culture of 18th century medicine, the history of public health, especially since the founding of the Public Health Service in 1798, the ways in which diseases related to women and children have been understood and discussed, and the intersections between medicine and cultural taboos. So a whole range of issues, obviously pertinent to many issues we're facing today. In 2010, the British Medical Association awarded her book, Condemnation. Well, I hope you heard that correctly, Condemnation. It's a wonderful pun, wonderful title. The US government's sex education campaign from World War I to the internet. The British Medical Association awarded this book its prize for the best popular book on medicine, as well as its prize for the best book furthering understanding of science and medicine among the general public. Lexi served as president of the National Council on Public History, and for the past 15 years, she's run a wonderful public history website, Beyond Academe. Thank you very much, Lexi. Thank you to all our guests, all our panelists, our speakers. We know, as I said before we began, how precious time is today. We thank you for the gift of your time. So thank you now, Lexi, for introducing our guests and moderating.
Thank you all for joining us today. As Joy said, I'm Lexi Lord, and I'm the chair as well as a curator in the Division of the History of Medicine and Science at the National Museum of American History, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. As you all may imagine, this past year has been an extraordinary one for historians and scholars of the history of medicine. But I think it's also been an extraordinary one for scholars of the humanities overall. And over the last year and a half, as our country has embarked on a broad-ranging conversation about our past and its role in shaping who we are as a nation, scholars in a variety of humanities-oriented disciplines have played a crucial role in this national conversation. And this discussion has occurred in many places. It's obviously occurred in universities and schools, in the media, in our legislative bodies, and in our museums and cultural institutions. And sometimes it's just occurred in our coffee shops and on the street and in our hallways of our different workplaces, virtual always, of course. And because these conversations have been so wide-ranging, I think we've not always had an opportunity to hear from colleagues who work in different places and who work in disciplines that differ from our own. So we're really grateful to ACLS for providing us with an opportunity to expand this conversation and to enable us to reach across different disciplines to explore the role that humanities can play in shaping this conversation about race, gender, the ongoing pandemic, climate change, and the legacy of our very complicated past. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I just want to say that we envision this as a somewhat informal roundtable discussion. So we'll begin the conversation with each speaker providing a 3-minute overview of their project before we launch into a much more informal discussion. And we'll then engage in a roundtable format, which will explore the projects. And at 5 p.m., we'll solicit questions from you for all of our speakers. So we're really excited to hear from you with your questions and your thoughts. After the panel, ACLS will send out links to all of these projects, and we hope you'll take the time to explore them in depth if you've not looked at them already. So let me begin by introducing our speakers. I'm just going to give a brief overview of our speakers because there was a little bit about each speaker at the beginning. So I'll start by introducing Tiffany E. Barber. She's an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Art History at the University of Delaware, and her project was the aptly titled Curating the End of the World. Juliana Rowen Barton is the director of the Center for the Arts at Northeastern University, and her project included the Crafting Resilience program series and the Craft Futures Fund mini-series in Folklife magazine. Sarah DeMott and Tracie Jones created a project, a joint project entitled Curating the Experience of Black Americans in the Age of a Pandemic at Harvard University. Sarah DeMott is a research librarian at Harvard, and Tracie Jones is the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at MIT. And finally, Michaela Woodward and Angelique Gonti created Community Spread, How We Faced a Pandemic at the Wing Luke Museum in Washington State. Michaela Woodward is the senior exhibit developer at the Wing Luke, and Angelique Gonti is an associate teaching professor at the School of Public Health at the University of Washington. So I want to begin with you, Tiffany, and ask if you could introduce your project.
Thank you so much, Lexi. It is really a pleasure to be here. I will share my screen really quickly and just in awe of all of the presentations and projects that we'll be sharing today. Just to rewind, that's the exhibition I curated called Curating the End of the World. I organized it last year. It was a joint endeavor between the Black Speculative Arts Movement, New York Live Arts, and Google Arts and Culture. And the show is in 2 parts and really brings together an international cadre of artists whose work responds to COVID-19, anti-Black violence, climate change, poor governance, transhumanism, and an accelerating technologically driven economic system on the verge of collapse and or expansion, depending on how you look at it, from NFTs to other things that we're dealing with now. From spaces of isolation and enclosure, the featured artists crafted worlds as infinite as the quarantine's impositions, worlds inspired by speculative fiction, Black girlhood, Afrocentric concepts such as Sankofa, manga, cosplay, artificial intelligence, and some of the works were actually made through using artificial intelligence, time travel, pleasure, and the new normal of masks and virtual socializing. Masks were a recurring motif, and they doubled as protective gear as well as prosthetics for performing and concealing identity as a means for survival. The visions of survival in the show, however, are not necessarily desirable. They span the utopian and the dystopian, hopeful, yet also dark and pessimistic. As a curator, I let the artists and objects drive the shows I organize. With Curating the End of the World, there was already a conceptual framework in place because it was artists were responding to an open call. And this really informed my curatorial strategy with the show. The animated shorts, collages, photographs, poems, and sound pieces that you'll see once you scroll through the show, the two parts of the show are otherworldly and fantastic. And from the start, we knew that we wanted writing, poetry, short fiction in the show because of the role that literature plays within the Black speculative imagination. But doing this virtually was quite the challenge. So I had to narrow the selections and to start to identify themes that came out of the submissions, and both parts are intimately linked and they build on one another. I hope you'll have a chance to scroll through those. And from the objects submitted, certain sub-themes and dynamics emerge, such as darkness in terms of imagery, tone, even color palette, and many of the objects resonate with the weight and uncertainty of our time at the time in 2020, but that has also continued. And so it's really interesting to see how the exhibition continues to unfold and endure against the backdrop of COVID-19. And so I think I will end there. I hope you'll have a chance to click through the exhibition. Sorry for all the technical difficulties.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thanks for powering through with those difficulties with the technology. And I hope everyone will have a chance to look at the site. As I said, ACLS will send out the links afterwards as well, so you'll be able to click on them then. So Juliana, if I may ask you to introduce yourself and your project.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much, Lexi. Can everyone see my screen?
Right.
Great. Thank you so much to ACLS for having me. I'm the recipient of one of the first rounds of the ACLS Leading Edge Fellowship, and I'm really grateful for ACLS's support, without which I wouldn't have had the opportunity to organize the programs that I'm speaking about this afternoon. So I'm Juliana Rowen Barton. I'm an art historian and a curator and educator specializing in architecture and design. And from 2020 to 2021, I was the ACLS Leading Edge Fellow at the Center for Craft, where I developed a portfolio of virtual engagement initiatives that sought to support various craft communities impacted by the pandemic. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of one of the initiatives, or actually like one and a half. It largely one that I organized on behalf of the center in collaboration with UNC Asheville, which was called Crafting Resilience. You're seeing the poster for that here. So around this time last year, I spent a couple of weeks doing a listening tour amongst faculty at UNC Asheville, members of the Asheville arts community, artists, craft organizations in my network, as well as in the center's network, all about their own individual investments, dialogue around craft, study and practice, and getting their thoughts on what were UNCA's core curricular points for the last academic year, which included addressing structural racism, the ramifications of the 2020 presidential election, and COVID-19. So in synthesizing all of the really rich and wonderful conversations I have, a powerful and moving theme emerged around the relationship between craft, resilience, and well-being. So under this umbrella, I developed a series of 3 virtual public programs that explored how craft could cultivate strength and sustainability in individuals, spaces, and communities in the face of adverse conditions. So the programs, there we go, ranged in size, in scale and content, engaging artists, thinkers, activists, and educators in workshops, roundtables, and participatory conversations, informed by largely craft histories, but with an eye towards building resilient futures. So you're seeing the 3 main public programs on the Center for Craft's website here, and although they happened in the past, the recordings are available online, and that link will go to you. Just a really quick overview. The first program on public health and collective memory brought together artists and scholars and public health experts to discuss how critical and creative practices around craft and public art could be imagined to better serve and support the well-being specifically of BIPOC communities. And the conversation ranged from discussing the legacy of public craft projects like the AIDS quilt to how and if to memorialize the pandemic and its racialized impact. That particular part was supported in, brought to the forefront in the conversation by Monument Lab's Associate Director of Public Programs, Dr. Patricia Kim. The last program in the series, Activism and Overcoming Obstacles, put ceramic artist, activist, educator, and spoken word poet Roberto Lugo in conversation with activist, educator, and curator Michelle Miller-Fisher, where they discussed how they use their creative platforms to address and expose social inequities in the fields of art, craft, and design. And this really moving conversation, Roberto and Michelle are colleagues, but also consider each other friends, and it dove really deep into the concepts of resilience on both individual and collective levels, both around one's adverse conditions personally with respect to mental health, but also the impact of COVID more broadly. So this middle program here on education and community engagement highlighted project recipients from the Center for Crafts, Craft Futures Fund project, which was a rapid response grant developed to support craft communities around the United States and their creative responses to COVID. I'm running out of time, so I'm just gonna show you this brought together artist Tanya Aguaniga, who got a grant to support a clay camp on the US-Mexico border with LGBTQ asylum seekers. So these are some photos of the program that she coordinated. Another example that was brought to this conversation was a wonderful program to create community among isolated artists with disabilities in the Bay Area through sending materials to them by mail and then having online workshops to create the community that they lost with their access to the studio space. Here are a couple more photos of that. And then I also, in addition to the programs, I co-authored a really wonderful piece with another ACLS leading edge fellow, Emily Burrow, who worked at Folklife magazine, about 2 other Craft Futures Fund projects. But I want to make sure we can talk about those later if others are interested. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliana. I think everyone's going to have a great time exploring the website after the conversation. Tracie and Sarah, may I ask if you could both introduce yourselves and your project?
Yes, I am going to share screen. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself while I do that?
Sure, I'll get us going. My name is Sarah DeMott, and Tracie and I are working together on the American Experiences during COVID-19 pandemic, which is a library guide at Harvard University, where I'm a research librarian and faculty librarian for a freshman seminar. And I'll Tracie, pass to you for your new title.
So my name is Tracie Jones. I'm the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the MIT School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. But when we worked on this project, I was the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
Wonderful, thank you. And first of all, I just wanted to give you guys an overview of what is a library guide, because that was a new term for many people. And basically, research libraries and research librarians often put together a guide or a finding aid to help people find specific topics. So there could be a finding aid on how to find historical sources, how to find 19th century literature, or in our case, we decided to use the format and kind of co-opted a bit of the library guide and the server space at Harvard Library to create this guide addressing the material, the flood of material that we were seeing in real time about the effects of COVID it was having on the Black American experience particularly. I was reading through some of our emails last night and people were calling it the novel coronavirus. And so it was really that early on that we started this guide. And what we had done, it's almost like if you've worked in archives of thinking about a clipping file or, a scrapbook of newspaper clippings and articles and conversations, we began by gathering materials and putting it on this website that is going to be, that's in perpetuity at Harvard, and was really thought of at the beginning to be a guide for students who might be doing a research project on COVID. We know that our students often want contemporary topics. So I thought, oh gosh, when my first year students come back to campus, they're going to want to talk about this. They're going to want to write about this. But we are also very concerned that this moment be captured and that these themes that we were seeing, the effects on the African-American communities in the US weren't forgotten. So these themes on the side, you can see all these tabs were kind of organic tabs that we saw coming out of the literature or coming out of the materials and popular culture that we were seeing. Trace, can you? Thank you. So this is a page within the guide. So we have the major guide that you saw, the first page, and then within the guide, there's all these topics ranging from health to data to housing, protest movements, music, diaspora, film, theater. This one specifically is on labor and economy, and I'll just point to how you would read this guide. They're just the clippings that come out day to day that we were just inventorying as they came. Tracie and I were kind of using our sources and emailing ourselves these great big collections of material. You can see at the top that we also have a feature called a co-curator, which Tracie is going to tell us a little bit about how that works. And we also have a feature called keyword search. So if you're used to searching in a library catalog, there's often a keyword that you're looking for in terms of finding materials to support the topic. You can also see that these lists of materials are all chronological. So they're as we found them. And the types of materials range from news articles to town hall meetings. We went to a lot of Zoom meetings in the community and, grabbed the recordings from a YouTube video. There's some webinars, blog posts. We have calls from incarcerated women that we were able to gain access to, government reports. We have an environmental justice walking tour, voter registration panels. So, kind of a range of popular public voices in the community. I'll let Tracie go. And then our last part of this project was our workshops and gatherings. And so in addition to ourselves creating materials, we also went out to our communities and said, we'd love to hear your materials as well. So we did some crowdsourcing. We also did some workshops on how to create materials. So we talked about storytelling and journal writing. We did workshops on Just Flicks, which is a type of documentary filmmaking with your cell phone that we brought into high schools. We did a community call and response. And so these were all ways to kind of enhance the voices of whose material is being collected and whose perspective is being collected in this kind of COVID archive that we were imagining for Harvard.
And I'm just going to close this out because we are running out of time, but it was important for us to be in relationship with the community, which is why we created these co-curator spaces. So you can see here, this is education. This is our music. We have a playlist here, resources. And I just want to leave you with a quote from our co-curator for mass criminalization. It's Ashley Lipscomb. She's the Institute for Racist Education founder. So conditions in jails and prisons are inhumane. Incarcerated persons do not receive adequate food, clean water, healthcare, and mental health services. I know this because of the countless phone calls, letters, and conversations I've had with my mother during and beyond her incarceration. Therefore, COVID-19 in prisons and jails is a death sentence for every person incarcerated during this pandemic. Their deaths affect every child, sibling, aunt, cousin, neighbor, friend, mentor, faith leader, etc. Mass decarceration during this pandemic is essential business and needs to happen now. Black lives are human lives, no matter which sides of the bars they are on. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracie and Sarah. And I think it's going to be great if everyone takes an opportunity to delve really deeply. It sounds like an incredibly rich resource. If I could ask Michaela and Anjali, if I could ask you to introduce yourselves and your project.
Yeah, so I'm Michaela Woodward, and Anjali is here too. I'm just going to start us off by taking you back to February of 2020. The first recorded cases of COVID in the US were here in the Seattle area where we are, but even before the disease hit this country, Asian American communities were being affected by fear, racism, and xenophobia. Our museum is located in Seattle's Chinatown, and even during the Lunar New Year season, the neighborhood restaurants were empty, the streets were quiet, and the museum quickly shuttered. And so suddenly we're all working from home in this climate of fear, grief, and uncertainty. And then I got a call from Anju.
You did get a call from me. My name is Anjali, and before we get too far down the road, I just want to acknowledge that Michaela and I are coming to you from Duwamish territory in what's now called Seattle, and actually where the museum is and where Chinatown is an important area for Duwamish folks. So I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington, UW, in the School of Public Health, and we have all these seniors who are taking capstone projects. And I called Michaela because as soon as COVID hit, everything fell apart, right? I couldn't have students and placements. We all had to come back into the hole and figure things out. And for us, it was very local. For us, the first case was in Snohomish County. For us, Life Care Center was happening at the same time. You were watching it unfold the same time we were, and we didn't know if we could go outside and breathe. And so, and our students were even more panicked because they were the ones who would be levied with dealing with this because they were soon to graduate and had to be ready for a response. And so rather than turning them to the quantitative data around how public health does a great job of shining a flashlight on what's wrong and where what's wrong is happening, we decided to say, hey, you got to look at these oral histories and let's understand what's happening in our very own town right now. And the whole purpose of my class, it's a theory to practice class where we spend our time looking at public health theories and frameworks, and I want students to be able to apply them. And my whole goal in life is for the students to be able to be really good diagnosticians of when equity is not happening and when equity is happening. Instead of saying that's racist, I want them to say why and how and come up with a solution.
So Anju's students went out and collected oral histories in our communities. They documented a tremendous range of experiences. There were isolated elders, frontline workers, high school seniors who were graduating, and drive-through ceremonies. In our community, Pacific Islanders were hit particularly hard by the disease, and also, like many communities, by the fact that their cultural traditions were totally disrupted. We talked to one woman who said, if I don't go to these big family gatherings after church, am I even Samoan? It was like that existential. And then they also documented this incredible response to the crisis. Do you want to talk about that, Anju?
Oh yeah, and Michaela's downplaying. Michaela taught the students how to engage in an oral history process, who to pick, what to ask, all of those pieces. It was a really beautiful unfolding in the classroom. One of the things that we really wanted the students to have an opportunity to document is actually what my partner Rahul, who's also at Wing Luke, was talking about, which is this idea of dual power. What's happening? And here what we found is that dual power is when you have the people coming together to create their own systems while at the same time sort of looking at the advocating and looking at the idea of the fact that they haven't had the resources offered to them through government entities. So you would think that there would be a better sort of public health response, but there wasn't at the level you'd expect. And this is just another example of systemic racism. And so the students were able to document the mutual aid that just sprung up, that was there and always has been there in this community since the beginning of when the community established itself in this area. And so those are some of the pictures that you're seeing and also what's evidenced in the oral histories that they gathered.
So the interviews the students collected and others were the core of this exhibit that we created. And actually, if you walk around the corner, you can see that shirt that Namita embroidered. So connections. Yeah, so the exhibit was created. Our process at the museum is a community-based exhibit process. So we don't have curators. Instead, I gather together a group of people and facilitate this collaborative process to figure out what the exhibit's going to be. And Anju and her students, some of her students were actually part of that process. Do you want to say anything about that, Anju?
Yeah, they were really pumped to be there. So, the University of Washington, though we're sort of the big school here in the Pacific Northwest, we're a really local school. We have a lot of state students. And so the students who participated in collecting the oral histories, as well as curating the exhibit, also had long ties to the neighborhood as well. So it was really very, very hyper local. And for them, they felt like they were telling sort of some of the best stories that they could. In fact, Jessica Wynn, who was a part of this project, she was able to interview Dr. Pham, and her goal is to be a doctor. And Dr. Pham is at International Community Health Services, which is a public health clinic that came out of the dual power movement and is still there and is now doing tons more work than it did in the past. But there's one quote I just wanted to read that I think brings us to sort of the next slide that Mikhail's going to talk about. So Dr. Pham said, "Sure, everyone's affected." Oh, I should tell you when this interview was conducted. This was conducted in April 2020. So while the pandemic's really on, he said, "Sure, everyone's affected. Like the coronavirus doesn't care, but healthcare seems to kind of stratify based on who gets what. So I feel like the virus doesn't know the color of your skin or race, but I feel like healthcare does." And so we took that inspiration and went forward with documenting how the community is there to actually promote wellness versus spreading an illness.
I know we're going over time, but I wanted to share masks. I know we're part of everyone's experience, and everyone who's collecting was collecting masks. And just quickly, on the far right, there's this tattered N95 that the doctor working at that first nursing home was the first N95 he got a hold of, and he wore it for a month before he could get another one. On the left is an art mask made of silk and copper by a native artist in solidarity with Asian American women. In between, there's masks made by aunties using ear loops were made out of shoelaces and hair ties. And there are masks with political statements, masks with slits for straws. There's so many stories that masks were telling in this exhibit and in this whole experience. And I'll let Anju take us home.
Yeah, I think the main bit here is, and Michaela can talk about what this picture is. I think the main thing we wanted to say was not only can students hop in there and have the ability, these are undergraduates, seniors who are were soon to graduate. They can collect data and know what to do with it and figure out how best to intervene when it comes to public health. But I think sort of what we were hoping the students would get and what we hope to communicate a little bit in this exhibit is sort of asking public health to lean in a little bit to community and lean in a little bit to saying, I think you all have your answers. And I think we just need to kind of get in there and do something about it. And so, Michaela, do you want to describe this photo? Because I think it's just such an example of what we're hoping to capture.
Yeah, the Jade Garden restaurant was hit by vandalism and anti-racist vandalism, and they were having a nightmare when the students interviewed the owner. He was getting no help from the government. He was very upset, so here we have, this is the last summer, and the place has got a line out the door of masked patrons coming in back to the neighborhood to enjoy the restaurants and the community there. Thank you. Sorry we went over.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you all. It was really fascinating. And I want to thank you, especially all of you, because you really were able to sort of illustrate how objects can really tell these extraordinary stories about the pandemic and also the ongoing issues that we face in regard to racism, gender issues, and obviously climate change as well. So I want to start just by asking broadly based questions, but I want to encourage our speakers also to ask questions of one another as well. We see this very much as a discussion. And then at 5 p.m., I'll open this all up to questions from the audience, and you can post the questions in the Q&A. And I already saw it's great. We already have a couple questions from our audience, so we'll get to those at 5. But I want to start by asking this question about partnerships and different backgrounds. Really interesting how you all have reached across different disciplines. It's not just the partner groups, it's actually the other groups as well, both Tiffany and Juliana as well. And so I'm curious when you all saw this, particular type of partnership as possible, and how you used your different backgrounds to inform your approach. And I thought maybe we should start with Tracie and Sarah.
Yeah, well, I left because on my desktop I have a folder called Lemonade, and and that is it. Oh, you are, yeah.
Okay. It was started with me to try to figure out a way for us to engage with what was happening in real time. And, it was just personal for me as a Black woman, having a platform of Harvard and not knowing how to talk about what was happening to the Black community. So I reached out to Sarah as a librarian, and I sent her a syllabus from Candace Bembo, who created a response to Beyonce's Lemonade. And I said, can we do something like this? And Sarah said, sure. So Sarah, I'll let you go from there.
Well, yeah, that's our kind of our aha moment story, is that, well, it's the aha moment, and it's also and I love to hear how you guys are also thinking about this, but we had this syllabus that was a response to Beyonce's Crisis of Lemonade and the Black feminist community's way of understanding, domestic violence, abuse, Black joy, womanhood, and thinking about what is that, how does that work as an instrument of epistemological knowledge making or community making or ways of thinking, ways of being, that is more than just the material of it, right? So in the library, we're collecting material, and this framework of thinking about, this is how Black womanhood collectively responds and says, let's get together, let's read about this, let's collect this material. Could we do something similar? So that was really kind of our core, like, yeah, we could do this in a response to what our crisis is at the moment. So I thank you for that invitation, Trace.
Actually, Tiffany, I'm going to go to you because I was really struck by the different groups that you collaborated with and the idea of an open call to different types of artists. So I'm curious how that sort of drove you as well.
Yeah, the Black Speculative Arts movement, I might say it's probably about 5 years old as an organization, but has been an outgrowth of some thinkers, transnational and international thinkers around issues of the past, present, and future of Black life in the US and broadly in the diaspora. So it's been this kind of cross-continental conversation for longer than the 5 years, but and so the New York Live Arts was doing some programming around Black futurity and brought Black Speculative Arts movement onto the project. And I have consulted and liaised with Black Speculative Arts movement for the last few years. And then when we were looking for a platform, because New York Live Arts is one of the cultural partners for Google Arts and Culture, it all came together in that way. But we tried many other things leading up to that, and I can talk more about that later. I think there's a question about technology later, but yeah, and I was asked because I've been writing on visual art and the African-American visual art tradition, specifically within the discourse of Afrofuturism and or Black futurity. And so, and thinking about the aesthetic and political stakes of that work for the last 10 years. So that's kind of how I got brought onto the project.
Great. Anjali and Michaela, I know you started this, but I'm just a little curious to talk about this moment when you both realized that this is the partnership that's going to really be possible, and how your very different backgrounds really informed the project, sort of the strengths of that very different approach.
Well, I mean, I knew it was going to work I knew it was going to work because I know Anju, but from before. I mean, we've known each other, and I knew it was going to. Anything with Anju is great and fun. But I think when I first met the students, it was like, okay, this is going to be awesome. Like these students are so engaged. They were, you know, we have a lot. The people we were arranging for them to interview were some of the people in the older generations in our communities, and you know, connecting them to the younger students was just. Right, what we're all about. It was really great. So, and I think we found out our two fields have a lot of similarities, in particular around our efforts to go from our kind of colonial pasts to like become more inclusive fields. So
yeah. So like, and I think Michaela took them through such a great process where they were so able to apply. So the three theories that I talk about the most in class are critical race theory, of course, where would we be? Next, I talk a lot about life course perspective, which allows us to understand health within a particular context, right, across the lifespan. And then we talk about cultural wealth framework. Why does that matter, right? And so what the students were able to do, what I was hoping for, and which did happen, was that as students were learning about their own communities and interviewing people they knew, they were seeing themselves in that as well. And so instead of kind of having a deficit understanding of who they were, they actually noticed all the strengths that they had in terms of moving through and doing well, and knowing that they had a lot to contribute as it related to public health. I think the other thing about the weirdness, and I think I mentioned this when we met some time ago, but I often think of I'm really lucky to be in social work and in public health, because that means we get to hang out with everybody, because people have problems everywhere and people's bodies are either ill or well everywhere all the time. And so that means you get to hang with cool people and find ways that people can be well. So like when I used to work at the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, we would make necklaces all the time because we had to gift them. And that practice of doing that craft helped us to feel normal and okay, and chilled us out, and we talked story and hung out, and it was lovely and wonderful. And then when I think about I take that further, I kind of think about, gosh, I get to have strange bedfellows. And you know, I live here in the Pacific Northwest, and out here we have the Salish Sea, which is a massive estuary where freshwater and saltwater come together, and it's brackish water, meaning only a couple things get to live there, and in special ways, and in certain pockets, and in really interesting, neat ways. And when basically those of us in academia, well, anywhere really, we saw our worlds coming in going, how are we supposed to teach class at the same time and meet all these expectations? I was like, I'm just gonna go look at the water for a little bit because I'm sure it's gonna give me an answer. And I was like, Rahul was on the phone, and I grabbed the phone and I said, we need to figure this out, Jessica and Michaela, what are we doing? We have to collect everything, and only we can do it because we're looking at it in both ways. And so that's kind of how that happened. Is just the more I hang out in an estuary, the better it is.
A great image. I love that. And Juliana, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this. I know you applied for and got the LEAF Fellowship and used that. And I'm just curious sort of what led you to that and how it was stepping outside the academy on this kind of project.
Oh, it was great. I am trained. I never had any intention to go into the academy, I think maybe. So the Leading Edge Fellowship was the perfect kind of opportunity for me. While doing my graduate work, I also worked as a curator in museums, and have continued to do that. So it really allowed me, I think, I love the broader audiences that I get to interact with and engage with through outside of academic work, whether that be museums or whether that be public programs or other sorts of community engagement, which were really the focus of the fellowship I got to work on. But I think my strength is that coming from an academic background, I'm able to partner with academic institutions. Like for my fellowship, I worked both with UNC Asheville and with a Warren Wilson College program. I'm in an academic program now and able to kind of facilitate and be a convener of all, as we've been talking about, bringing lots of interdisciplinary conversations together. So yeah, I got to work with an incredible public health specialist at UNC Asheville who already like had a buy-in on how craft and the arts could be part of a public health conversation. I didn't have to convince her. She was already bought in. And so let's think about who else we can bring into that conversation to share it more broadly. So I think those partnerships with particularly in and around academic settings can be really fruitful for making sure the rich dialogues that happen among scholars can be more widely understood and digested and kind of circulated.
Great. Yeah, really interesting. So I'm curious about how you all, I know some of you've touched on this, but I'm curious about the technology and sort of the ways in which documenting race equity and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on this virtual platform, working in isolation in many ways that presents both challenges and opportunities. And so I'm curious what you all would say was the most challenging or rewarding aspect of the process. I'm not suggesting that we continue to work in isolation and in our little offices on Zoom, but it certainly has opened up some really amazing potential. At the flip side, it also has presented some problems. I've definitely seen this in my own work. So I'm curious what you all would say. And I guess we'll start, actually, maybe I'll flip this around, but if we want to start with you, Michaela and Angeli, what that was like, especially in a partnership.
So one thing that, oh, hi, there I am, hi. One thing that was kind of great was it turns out you can do oral histories on Zoom, like it works pretty well. I was a little skeptical, but of all the things I've done on Zoom, that was the one that translated the best, I think. So that was kind of great. I think the super challenge was like, I work in a museum. I'm all about the actual gallery experience, the physical objects, the like in-person, real life, flesh and blood meet world. And I'm still not sure how to navigate this whole thing, trying to do it digitally. But there was a piece in the exhibit that was really touching and moving. An artist, Tamiko Thiel, is Japanese American, and she had scanned her iPad Surface after a day of getting her mom a vaccination appointment and made it into this gorgeous image. I can put the link in the chat to this project. So I was amazed at how artists were using technology to create things for this, but I have had a really hard time myself with it. I'll get Andrew to talk.
Well, you know, these are 20-year-olds, so it's no big deal for them, right? They're like, hey, no problem. And I mostly had no clue what was happening because I'm basically Amish, like I don't do any of that stuff. And like, you know, the students were really great at getting all that going. And I mostly was like, yeah, Michaela, it's totally gonna work, whatever, it's fine. And I was lying to you, Michaela, because I didn't really know if it was going to work or not. And then I was lying. And then I think the other thing for me in their work was how empowered the students felt being able to be on their own, kind of doing that work. And the other piece that came for me too is what I was reading to feel less worried. And everything around this technology stuff at that time when we're learning what to do, all comes out of disability justice work, all of it. And so I just feel blessed to be able to have learned from folks locally here around how to do some of that. And I'm just so grateful to what was opened as a result of their activism.
Yeah, well, Tiffany, I thought the technology and your exhibit online, I really just loved the way that it flowed. And so I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about that virtual platform that you used and the ways in which changing technology have really shaped your project. And right now, as looking at it, it seems like I just see incredible strengths, but perhaps it was more challenging.
It definitely was. I mean, one of the things that I think the biggest challenge was the fact that the exhibition, when I was first approached to curate it, there weren't flexible, nimble, open access platforms at the time that were ready to accommodate moving image technologies, sound technologies in this really fluid way. Google Arts and Culture was really the only platform at that time that was that we had access to without having to pay enormous fees, and also that would allow us to have to embed video and sound works and to kind of pair and to kind of emulate what walking through an exhibition in a museum or gallery space would feel like if you were juxtaposing works or trying to kind of create conversations between different objects. And so that was really a huge challenge. And the extended challenge of that is that Google Arts and Culture is extremely proprietary. So they basically now like own all the metadata for the objects that we had to code into the platform. So it's not great in terms of artist relations. This is also a year and a half ago, so maybe that has changed. And I will say that what was exciting about that was that so many of the artists were already working in these newer technologies, responding to artificial intelligence, data collection and visualization, and all of these things that I really wanted to be in the exhibition. And so Google Arts and Culture was able to support that. What has been most rewarding about that process, I think, in terms of not only meeting the needs of the artist, but also the ways in which the exhibition has been able to travel, or how people have been able to access it and experience it, which I would have never guessed that somebody, people in South Africa looking at it and all over the place. And, we got a lot of press for it and interviews about it that were coming from all over the world. So that was really exciting. And I think just one of the advantages of being able to work on a virtual platform. But yeah, it didn't come without its challenges. Luckily, it came together really nicely, but it was a lot of work. And I will say that what you're responding to in terms of how it flowed was all my curatorial vision. So I'm glad that that's translating, Lexi.
It's wonderful. It was for me a lesson, actually. I think our museum has some things to learn from your exhibit. It's just fabulous. I've opened the door to a lot of new technologies for us. So, and plus it's just a really cool and fun exhibit to go through. So, yeah. So, Juliana, I'm curious about your experience, especially because I'm guessing that you may have gone to work in a virtual environment without getting an opportunity to really meet your colleagues in person. Am I correct?
Yep, I did my fellowship of, I'd say 90% of it remotely. So I was completely enabled by technology in that sense. But I think what I find really interesting, or the presence of technology in the projects that I worked on, particularly, one of them was a completely virtual program series, which was wonderful in terms of, bringing people from Philadelphia to Asheville to Chicago together for conversations, or in the conversation that's documented through Folklife magazine, they're chronicling culture in crisis with my fellow ACLS fellow, Emily Rogers. That was with Namita Wiggers, who Michaela was mentioning, in Portland, and Lisa Wolfork in Charlottesville, Virginia. Just like conversations that really couldn't happen, and the kind of connections that are able to be made and bridged and forged through technology, in spite of isolation, I think is one of the really powerful things we've overcome in the past. I think I heard on the radio this morning, 19 months. But that was also a really major theme of the Craft Futures Fund program. And one of my tasks as a fellow was to promote and support those recipients. And those projects range from ones like the NIAD Art Center in Oakland, bringing artists with disabilities out of isolation through Zoom platforms and giving them workspaces to rebuild those communities that they lost even if they were at home, but some more analog programs, all of it like going back to the making and finding ways to translate the in these cases, the value of craft and craft communities, even across digital platforms. And I think by and large, all of the recipients really engaged that well. And I was so proud to work with and get to know all of these community craft centers and other craft educators across the country who are finding really, really innovative ways to like work with technology or in spite of technology when their jobs are so tactile. Like they would never have thought that they could teach how to make a pot over the internet with clay or something like that. So it's really a testament. I know my series was called Crafting Resilience, but it really is a testament to the resilience of the kind of artistic communities that are embedded across the country.
And it's really interesting you use that word community constantly. I'm just thinking about the ways in which we're creating new communities on the internet. It's just fascinating. I'm sure we all feel this experience where we feel we've met people. We may never meet in real life, but these are now our colleagues in a way because of technology. So yeah, and I know we're coming up to audience questions, but I did want to give an opportunity for Sarah and Tracie also just to talk a little bit about this challenge of working through and using a virtual platform. I'm guessing you both had an opportunity to know one another and work together before, but I mean in person. So perhaps that helped, or?
I think the power of the technology was in the way that we could bring people together. I mean, just one of the projects of working with high school students in Fredericksburg with Just Flicks, they were using their cell phones to actually go out and talk about their experience with COVID. And so being able to bring that into the library system is something that we would have never thought about before. And Sarah, if you just want to talk about all of the events and town halls you were jumping in and out of.
Well, I was new to Cambridge, so I was coming from New York, and so I didn't have a huge base of knowing the community of the Boston Cambridge community, and so I attended more town halls, and I was, I have a rolling list of friends now who have attended my film series or our film series. And so I was joking to Tracie, I said, do you remember when we went to NAACP last year in Boston? She's like, what are you talking about? I said, we spent a whole Saturday there. But we did, and all of us have those types of Zoom stories. But I think the real technology boost for us, in addition to the interpersonal, I mean, how many mornings did we wake up to CNN News reports with together? But there was also, the part of the library is selection plus access is kind of what libraries do. And so I think in this process, we were able to take server space and a platform space. I mean, Tiffany, your thing about Google is like, that's the challenge of doing anything on a virtual platform. And we were able to mobilize Harvard's resources and then diffuse them and spread them out to the community. So that kind of way of negotiating Harvard Library as a platform and then pushing it out to the communities for their use and contribution and shared, it was almost beyond open access. It was just free. And I'd love to hear more from Michaela about their ideas about, co-curating or just not even curating, it's theirs, or it's a joint or it's shared, or how do you move into that space of, from a library curated collection to a co-curated to just open. And so that's, kind of what we got a taste of, and thinking about that in terms of what that means for diversity and equity in our universities and institutions. That's my soapbox, I guess, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary thing to think that technology in some ways actually can address or assist us in making sure that we provide greater access to these materials, which is fabulous. So I'm going to actually turn to questions from the audience. And our first question is, how did you all gauge virtual attendees or user engagement beyond just counting the visits to the website or the virtual events? And I think that's such a tricky question, especially thinking about engagement and what do we mean by engagement? So I'll throw this out and actually ask any of you to respond rather than sort of putting you on spot, because I think you all probably have done different things.
I think, so I didn't touch on this part of the kind of engagement initiatives that I worked on, but I also, in addition to kind of public programs where, you know, those kind of numbers are important for figuring out who's attending and, you know, surveys and things like that, I also organized some private convenings among the recipients of these grants to have conversations almost like affinity groups. And for me, the impact is probably intangible or immeasurable, but mostly just that they were able to connect with each other. There was no cohort system in that setting. So, you know, bringing together people who worked in youth craft education, or folks from our network who did community craft, and like bringing them together so they could talk and troubleshoot some of the issues that they were coming up against. Often with a facilitator, these kind of smaller conversations didn't have a lot of people, wouldn't have made a splash in terms of numbers, but that intimate group, those intimate groups and those conversations allowed for really deep, rich engagement with each other that almost like I was able to step out of, and it was really about making connections amongst the group. And so I think impact there was more about being a convener or a platform for the conversations to happen, whether they're public or private. Yeah.
Can I hop on to that, Juliana? I really appreciate what you said there, because I was thinking about how it's that numbers question that often makes the case for why something like this can't happen, right? It's not going to attract the right group. It's not going to attract enough people, and sort of that embedded sort of, I don't know, can I say this, or that white supremacy culture that's embedded in that kind of showing up there. And so I just appreciate you talking about how and why sort of the intensity and the quality of the space and the few people there is so important, because that's how people can get more attracted. Like the more we put out there, the more people can be attracted to what is and see more. And so I appreciate that.
I think for us, one of the things was not just who was interacting with our material, but also for us to have it infused into Harvard. So it's now part of Harvard's archives. They've archived it as a COVID event and project. And so for us to have this moment that I think can be easily forgotten or minimized, to have it stamped into the archive is really important for us. So
I'd like to add to that, because our platform was also a community platform. So we had workshops, we had storytelling, we had film series, we had a book club. So people were looking to us to build community, and we saw huge numbers at our film series of 200, 300, 400 people. People just needed a space to be in conversation. And we saw that they were building community, you know, amongst themselves through the chat, and then contributions. And we were getting in so many contributions, and Sarah was getting so many emails about, thank you for this, I'm using it in my class. I had kids who were reading some of the material, just bringing Cardi B into the platform, was having children say, actually, I can engage with this. And so I think it was a larger community presence that showed up than what we thought we would have.
Yeah, I'll just add to that by saying that when I first started working on, well, all throughout working on the exhibition, I was really thinking of it as this kind of like pseudo corporate commercial space, like because it was attached to all these organizations and cultural institutions. And to that point, New York Live Arts has continued to use some of the works in the exhibition or highlight the exhibition in their ongoing programming around futurity for the last year and a half. But what has been really great is that there have been, like I said, there have been so many people from around the world who've engaged with it. And have emailed me and been like, oh, can you contextualize this exhibition for us? Can you come into my classroom? Can you come and share on this panel, for instance? And it's just a weird thing that I was like, oh, I got asked to do this thing. This seems like a cool opportunity. Cool. I will do it. It was stressful. Okay, I'm done with it. And now, a year and a half later, it still has this life that's very rich. And so the community engagement continues to grow. with my particular exhibition. And so, and it reaches across, much like the media and that's featured in the exhibition, as well as, the disciplinary frameworks that are featured. It really reaches across different publics. And so that's, I think, one of the exciting things about it.
Yeah, really interesting discussion. I wish we could go even deeper, because this question about numbers versus real engagement, which is, I think, something that we all struggle with, whether we're talking about, number of students in a classroom, even versus number of folks showing up to see a virtual program or an exhibit. And sometimes it's really about the engagement, which is much more important. I want to ask a broadly based question. And first of all, I do want to address the second question that we have, which is, and this is correct, the Harvard Reading Guide is accessible to the general public. Sarah and Tracie both made that really clear. So we're all going to share that link afterwards with our friends and family. I think it's great. Really excited by it. But we also had a question, which was, I think, directed to you all, which was, and I think this is a really complicated question. What did it mean for you personally to engage in and analyze the pandemic while experiencing the pandemic trauma that we all experienced? Many of us lost people we care about during the pandemic. We were driven by and shaped by fear for ourselves, for our families, for our loved ones. And so the question, I think, of how did you find the energy and the capacity to embark on a new project that delves really deeply into an extraordinarily difficult topic that you're dealing with personally. So I'm curious, and I'll just throw it out because I think that's such a huge question, but really important one.
I love to answer that because that is the reason why we did the project. I needed a space to grieve. And I needed a space to be able to talk about this in real time. And we started in April, and George Floyd murders happened in May. And so this is, for me, what saved me, creating the town halls, creating the film discussions, allowing young people and family members and communities to contribute to their experience. And, when I came to Sarah, I was like, as a Black woman with a platform of Harvard, I need to document this pain. And that is that's what saved me. This was my community. And we were on the phone every day. I mean, I spent so much time on the library guide that it was hard for me to grieve in a different way, because she couldn't go to funerals or anything like that. So yeah, this was my savior.
I would just add, kind of along that note, and maybe in a slightly different tone, I had a program scheduled for the day that the Derek Chauvin verdict came down, and I ultimately postponed it for exactly this reason. Or we, in a collective decision with the panelists, it was the program that was going to be talking about overcoming obstacles. Roberto Lugo's super open about the racism and mental health issues that he's in kind of obstacles he's encountered in his life, and it just felt not that like stepping back and not having that conversation in that moment felt like the best thing to do. So also sometimes taking a step back and realizing where my voice or that conversation was not needed at that moment. We all needed a little bit of space to process everything that was happening. And that felt like a really important balance to, like, I wanted to be having this conversation, and I'm so glad we had it a couple of weeks later. I'm really glad that it didn't distract from the grief and processing that needed to be happening in that particular moment as well. So I think being like the ability to be nimble and responsive seems to be a thread in all of our projects as well, and one that we've all learned to do as we've struggled to work in and through the pandemic.
Yeah, I'll just add to that and say that one, I was thinking in terms of drawing energy and capacity, was really thinking pedagogically about it and how this could be a model for my students. I mean, I teach in Black studies, obviously, but I'm an art historian, and my secondary appointment is in art history. And so thinking about visual analysis as a method and how transferable skills from Black studies and art history can help students transition into the work field in times of crisis was definitely at the forefront of my thinking with this exhibition. And it's been really great to see how students from not just my university, but elsewhere have responded to the show and the possibility that they could easily do something like this. I mean, they're already making media all the time. And so that has been a source of inspiration. I will also say that so much of what the work does in the exhibition is, and I mentioned this in my opening remarks, but it's really about this kind of like, how do we grapple with darkness and uncertainty? What kinds of images are we making? What kinds of stories are we telling about ourselves and where we are in our history and in our relationships to one another? And it's not always rosy, and we don't always have the capacity to take rest, to Juliana's point. And that I think especially historically disenfranchised populations, it's really important for us to underline how these systems continue to impact and circumscribe our lives. And not to necessarily think of a way out per se, but to really kind of make space to just sit in that. And I think that that's part of what kind of how I was drawing, where I was drawing energy and capacity from, which isn't necessarily like, the most optimistic place, but I think it's also a sign of the times. And I think that it's really important to register that.
I'll jump in. I think personally for me, it was just a huge relief to be able to dive in and have a thing to do, have opportunity to sit with people and talk with people about this and be together in it in some way, even if it was on Zoom. And I think, I have always sort of tried to frame in my mind, like the work we do at the Wing Luke and cultural work in general is the social justice project. It is how we are sharing stories, getting people to see something in a new way. And that was definitely our goal. And in the exhibit, we created, the artist Renee Young had this project called #Ask the Pandemic, where she was sort of asking people to ask the pandemic questions put them on Post-its. And so we have this sort of altar space with these Black Post-its, and the prompt there was, what are you mourning? What have you lost? And then on the other side of the exhibit, we had the prompt, what have you learned? And what do you want to share? And so those two sort of butcher paper, scroll of butcher paper kind of spans the exhibit, and those two meet in the middle, and people have been adding to it. And so kind of creating that space to hold that grief, and also the lessons that people want to carry forward from this was, we felt like I felt great that I could contribute, I could contribute a small piece to the project of creating that space for our visitors.
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. I know that I love that part of it, because I think the whole point of the exhibit is for people to sort of feel their feelings and talk about it. I think for me, at that time, we were kind of, as faculty, we were kind of being counseled to almost do less, right? Sort of like, just get through this quarter, get them through, kind of keep it chill. And that was outrageous to me. And I tell my students that I don't work for them, I work for the public, and that they're the thing that we mold to go out into the world to go make things better. And I just said, well, if you're telling me to not work as hard, I think that means I need to work even harder, because these folks have a job to do. And that's that they're coming out as undergraduate students, public health majors. They need to be able to answer people's questions in a good way, in a confident way. And so I think I just started working even harder. And then I felt like I felt like it was so important to create something with Michaela, and specifically in the Wing Luke, because I remember the first thoughts I had, I drove my family nuts. The first thoughts I had were, well, you can't have an outbreak at the museum because that's in Chinatown, and listen to what's happening. You all need to shut your doors. You all need to figure this out. We got to do this exhibit and get the message. Like, I was like lost my mind a little bit. And so I think for me and my family was like, you're overreacting. This is a flu. I was like, it is not. And so it is not. And so for me, it really was an opportunity to really prove to the students that we weren't kidding, and that this is what they had to be ready for if they were going to carry around this degree as a public health person.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is an ongoing and really fascinating question. and one that I think so many of us will continue to struggle with over the coming years, to be honest. This is not just something now. And we have a question that's very specific for Juliana, which is, how did you get access to the LGBTQ folks at the US-Mexico border in the Clay Camp project?
Oh, so that was one of the Craft Futures Fund projects that was awarded to the LA-based craft artist Tanya Aguaniga. And Tanya was born in Tijuana and grew up across the border. And so a lot of her own work as an artist engages working on the US-Mexico border. And so I believe she had connections to communities, particularly communities of asylum seekers and LGBTQ asylum seekers on the Mexico side of the border, and has connections to be able to bring resources back and forth to support that border community. And there's more about her Craft Futures Fund project on the Center for Crafts website, and I can make sure that that link to those projects that I've referenced gets shared along with the video recordings of some of the programs.
Great. I think we're actually running a little tight on our time. We do have two sort of quick questions. And I think what I'm going to do is ask each of the speakers to wrap up and talk a little bit about sort of their broader lessons that they've learned. And I do want to really encourage folks to take a look at these exhibits. They're just extraordinary, really just fascinating. But if I could ask the speakers to think about sort of the two last questions when they begin to wrap this up. One of them is about suggestions for best practices or platforms for online curation, and I think that's a really key question, because I think the pandemic has just opened up so many opportunities for folks. And the other is that this question about the situation of how people view and see a variety of different problems that the pandemic has presented. There's just an extraordinary disconnect, not just between the citizens of the state, but even between the citizens in the US. And so I'm curious how you all think about your projects and the potential for similar projects in a country where we are, to be honest, deeply, deeply divided and struggling with so many different issues. So I'll start by asking, I'll go, I guess, in alphabetical order. That way it's easy to do it. So I'll start with you, Tiffany, for Baker.
Sure. Final thoughts. That question about, I'll work backwards, I guess. The question about
Barber.
more severe, that's okay, more severe problems. I get Barbara, Baker, it's okay. More severe problems or more serious problems. I think that one of the things I don't know about at the policy level. I'm really fortunate, I guess, to be able to really be thinking on the ground of in the classroom. And so I really think a lot about the information and skills that I'm imparting to my students so that they can make informed decisions about however they want to live their lives. I also I don't teach from a place of trying to indoctrinate them about what's right and what's wrong. I really want them to have to develop their own critical thinking skills for them to decide what's right and what's ethical for them, based on their positions in the world. And so when it comes to thinking about more serious problems, like exposing them to things is absolutely part of my job. And I just hope that I'm giving them the skills that they need to be able to not make the world worse, at the very least. So that's part of the question, or my response to that. And then in terms of best practices for online curation, I don't know if you have the person who asked that, if you have any curatorial experience, but the way that I approached it, and I don't know if there aren't any, I don't think there are any guides to online curation. So if you want to write one, there's an opportunity to do so. But also a lot of the writing on like critical curatorial studies, or even just drawing from your own experience and how you want to bring objects together, what kind of conversation you want to be having, and really thinking about do you want to do thematic versus is this about a particular medium? Or, I mean, there are all these ways to kind of shape the focus of a particular exhibition, but the way that I work is through letting the objects and artists drive the shape of the thing that I make. And so it's really about collaboration and being in constant conversation with either living artists and or objects that have already been made. And so, yeah, so those are my responses. Thank you.
Yeah, really fascinating comment. We didn't get a chance to delve deeply in, but the idea of collaboration as a part of curation, just really an interesting whole conversation there. Juliana, if I may ask you.
Yeah, all of my curatorial work has still existed in the physical realm to the time being, at least when it comes to working with objects. Though I will say many of the curatorial projects I've worked on outside of the programs have been aided by work on Instagram and the kind of research platform that something like Instagram can offer to sharing resources, ideas, and kind of building that community. So I think not that I want to support social media any more than we all can do, leading into the second question of everything being interconnected. I mean, all of these questions of not just policy, but the pandemic and so many of the projects we talked on touched about racial equity, whether it comes from the AAPI communities or the movement for Black Lives. And I think the idea that none of these are happening in isolation, it's all connected. And for me, just touching back to the impact question that we brought on, one of the things I say often about my work is that I don't measure success by the fact that I was able to do this thing or that this thing happened, but whether or not the conversations continue in generative and kind of interlocking ways. So I hope that the conversations have started through the programs about public health and public art, for example. It was great that program happened, and I'm glad it's been recorded, but I hope audience members and others that the conversations that it sparked continued. And I think that's at least part of my response to how bad things can be, that if we can keep talking and keep generating the kind of projects that we talked about today, that's some glimmer of hope to me, at least.
I think, in terms of best practice, I might just give some really practical advice about just opening up a platform and getting started, because I find that what we would find is that the boundaries that the platform gives, whether it's you can't change the color of a box, or you can't add a tab, or the 3 tabs in, it's too much to navigate. Once you start playing in the platform, the logic of how you navigate it takes shape, and it's not always as you intend or you had hoped. So to some degree, you're bound by these platforms. And so I would say get started, play around, and it will help you define what you want. And then, if you need to go learn some code to hack things, that's an option later. But I guess that would be where I would say to get started. We just opened a page and started building it, and developers helped us along the way. In terms of, can you prompt me with the other question? The other question was my takeaway.
So sort of looking at the complexity of the multiple problems that we're facing, and also connect we're seeing between individuals in a state and individuals across the country as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Tracie and I were very upfront and frank about the fact that we are sitting at Harvard, and that the types of resources that allows us, and the types of voices that it gives us, the platform that we get picked up on, that it is quite exceptional in many ways. And so to our Nigerian friend in the chat, we realized that we're sitting in a really privileged spot as far as what we're able to pull off. I think at the same time, I think for me, what the takeaway was is how do you make systematic change? We have, Tracie was, working in diversity, inclusion, and belonging office, and we're bringing in new new programming and new positions in diversity, anti-racism at the library. And how do you do that? You know, how do you systematically work to that? What are the best ways to do it? It's not just highlighting collections, but it's changing the way we actually work and interact with each other. So I think, yeah, I'm laughing because I'm thinking of Cornel West's recent, you know, kind of respectability politics and what that means to make change and make change at places that are very established. And I think we, you know, Trace and I came up with this idea of collective community scholarship. And what would that mean at a place like Harvard? And would that not embrace maybe some of our folks in Nigeria and elsewhere to be part of our conversation in a more intimate way? I guess that's, you know, that's that would be my takeaway is, yeah, does this hint at a light of how, I'm not sure that we fully did it, but I think we started to articulate that there might be some ways to work towards systematic change in the way knowledge is produced in academic libraries and in academic campuses.
For sure, I'll just follow up on Sarah in terms of collective community scholarship. I think when you're starting to think about how do we come together across the divide, I think that is it, right? Bring in the community to have these conversations. And, you know, it was unfortunate, but fortunate that, you know, we were able to engage around George Floyd's murder and protest movements during a pandemic. And then bringing in the community outside of the Black community to see this experience through the lens of the Black community and through conversations and film discussions. I think we opened up people's ways of thinking, especially when we read through what was happening in the chat. And so I think if we can continue to do this with public libraries, with community organizations, the fact that we were able to bring in voices of incarcerated women, these are people in communities that you would never have access to. And I think these conversations need to happen. We shouldn't be studying them. We should be in relationship with them. So that's my takeaway.
Great. Thanks. And Michaela and Anjali?
Yeah, Tracie, thank you so much. You set up exactly what I was thinking just so perfectly. I want to hang out with you all the time. I was really just kind of thinking about the great Derek Bell and interest convergence and exactly what you're saying about these two things happening. And now suddenly, oh, look at how much more focus there is on BIPOC folks and the work, and that it's sort of, you know, there. And so for me, I just want to keep with that, keep in it, and keep propelling that forward. I noticed that's kind of when I stopped being afraid or worried about what my institution may think or not think. And it's okay, I can get yelled at sometimes, but whatever. We gotta do this work. And then also just remembering and keeping in mind and preparing for, in some ways, kind of what backlash may occur as a result. And so that's just really kind of where my mind is. It's about how do I get my mind right for both spaces? How do I get my mind right around both spaces and do what I can to be useful to the public and to help keep folks healthy? Michaela?
Oh, I feel like there's just a ton of wisdom and experience here. And I think, I guess the two things I would add. One is the power of first person stories. Like, this is something we really focus on at the museum. You know, it's not like everybody in our community committees agrees about everything, but if each of them has an opportunity to share their experience, their personal experience, then that can really open up a conversation and help people understand. And you can't like argue with each other about whether that thing happened to you, like, you know. And the other thing would be that, you know, I really think collaboration is the answer. And I think, you know, the work that we do at the museum, like Anju talks about estuaries as this metaphor. And I think for me, one of the other metaphors I use is the nurse log, which is a thing in the Pacific Northwest. We have a lot of these where, you know, the giant tree has fallen down and then out of that tree are growing all these other new trees. And I think that is the model that I think of for the projects I work on, where like, you're not going to like do it all at once. You're going to do one thing, and when that thing is over, you're going to see the new things arising out of that. And when that thing is over, then the next round of stuff is going to grow up. And if you're paying attention to all those things and nourishing the various relationships and building on each thing, you know, you can develop a healthy ecosystem where everyone can thrive. So that's what I try to think of when I'm in a Zoom meeting with a bunch of people, you know, or whatever it is. But thank you so much for, this was really great to be, it was an honor to be part of this. You guys are all rock stars, and I am really happy that we got to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It was really fascinating discussion. And I hope everyone will check out all of these amazing sites and resources. And I just want to turn it over to Joy.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. I won't be longer than to say, echo what was just said. You're all rock stars, and it was just such a wonderful experience to hear you. I'm sure I'm not the only person for whom, as we culturate to the new normal or whatever we're calling it, some of the hurt and loss of the pandemic has receded from my everyday consciousness, and that's that's because of the privileged place I live in, and because I've been insulated from some of the worst effects of the pandemic. And you've made me think about that and reflect on how knowledge and emotional associations and reflection work through the curating work you're doing. I won't try to express in any more detail the impact your work has had on me, but it's clearly made me take a deep think, and I know I'm not the only one. Thank you all so much. Just amazing work and great collaborative discussion, hugely exciting and inspiring, I know, for people in the chat, for their own students and communities. Thank you all, and thanks to our audience out there on Zoom. We're grateful you joined us today. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a good evening.